we are organizing as we're speaking. Thank you all for coming this afternoon. I'm really excited to be part of this panel. And we're going to be taking rotating roles as being chair. So I'm going to be the first chair for the panel. And I have a great delight to introduce Rosalyn Baxandall. She's a distinguished teaching professor emerita at SUNY Old Westbury. Now retired, she teaches at Queen's Acre School and Barnes Prison Project. Baxandall is the author of Words on Fire, The Life and Writings of Elizabeth Shirley Flynn, 1987, the co-author of Picture Windows, How the Suburbs Happened, Basic Books, 2000, the co-editor of America's Working Women, an anthology of women's work, 1620 to 1990, 1990, published twice, 1995 and 1976, and also the co-author co-editor of Dear Sisters, Dispatches for Women's Liberation, to be published in 2000. She helped found several daycare centers and was on the mayor's task force on daycare. So I'm going to turn this talk over to her.
I'm going to talk about the New York City women's child care struggle, but there were women's liberation daycare centers all over the U.S. and at many universities. What is interesting is that these child care centers and movements are excluded from most feminist histories and media. New York is a little special in that in 1970, New York City had a fifth of the child care centers in the country. Now, for some women in the feminist movement, childcare became a political issue and a means to achieve social and economic equality in a class society. For other community mothers, it became a center to care for their children and an important female social support network and neighborhood resource. In New York City, mainly mothers, with some help from dads and teachers, set up their own unlicensed underground child care centers for children 6 months to 4 years old. Most of the centers hired parents and community women, often without a high school degree. The city's rules, of course, required licensed teachers and social workers. Daycare became a national concern in the 60s due to government bureaucrats concerned with the rising welfare rates, the rise of single mothers, educators concerned with early childhood development, and a strong civil rights movement calling attention to the needs of African American women, and a Poor People's Campaign and the Women's Liberation Movement, and the necessity of women to work with inflation. Organized, inexpensive neighborhood child care was needed and desired, but unavailable. The state and federal government refused to provide child care. Therefore, local communities and working class families were on their own, and individual Black and Hispanic and feminist mothers took the initiative in New York City. This lack of child care, from another point of view, became a strength. Creative child care centers, all slightly different, grew untended like beautiful weeds and rare flowers. The neglect fostered a freedom and independence that led to ingenuity and then a concerted effort to preserve them. On the whole, those who visited the centers, like community people, newspaper reporters, politicians, and even Division of Daycare people, found the children being cared for in loving ways, and the centers all had huge waiting lists. Another show of this strength was the mothers who fought to protect them and preserve them and eventually make them legal. Among most professional educators and social workers, parent-controlled daycare connoted anarchy, confusion, and abuse, and trespassed the world and the territory of professionals. Parent control meant the basic decisions, cost, who qualified, who taught, and the curriculum would all be decided by the parents, the real experts. Beginning in the 1960s, New York City feminists and community activists rented vacant storefronts, usually for under $100 a month, fixed them up on a shoestring, and charged small fees. The parents and communities were invited to participate. Most started as co-ops. Parents, mainly mothers, providing the labor. Most went along merrily with constant money problems until the conservative Republicans and Southern Democrats fought to erase universal daycare and provide only compensatory child care for neglected and poor children. The informal centers saw child care as an entitlement for all and valued the cross-class, racial, and ethnic diversity. A few radical and feminist daycares experimented with non-hierarchical and democratic organization. Many of the centers with strong feminist presence challenged sex role stereotyping and encouraged girls to play sports, work with tools and become more assertive, and encourage boys to verbalize thoughts and express feelings and learn interpersonal skills. Having men work at the centers also confronted the mommy, mother, daddy, worker bifurcation. Some centers favored toys that could be used by a few children, like wheelbarrows, wagons, and rocking boats over tricycles. A few centers encouraged self-reliance so that the materials were accessible to the children and within their reach. Many involved the kids in washing dishes, picking up, and taught boys and girls to do it correctly. Many had collective projects like murals and tie-dyeing. Some created an alternative socialist culture and celebrated May Day, International Women's Day, and Bastille Day. Dramas and skits and songs also enforced the cooperative endeavors. In some centers, artists, musicians, and poets volunteered to do special projects. Many centers were bilingual. Some centers did become alternative families. We prefigured new forms of relationships. Children slept over at each other's houses, and parents, especially single mothers, like many of us, including me, were then, helped each other out regularly in crisis. By the late 60s, many of the mothers were experiencing burnout, keeping the centers funded and working in them. With inflation, most mother volunteers needed to work. Permanent funding was now offered through the government, but the stipulations were rigid. New York City was really fortunate to have Mayor Lindsay as the mayor, because he was open enough to hear the community and mothers' complaints and respond to our demonstrations in his offices about the stringent rules and a need for more childcare. Dozens of community control centers called a meeting to try to fight the government collectively. As a result of our first meeting, the Committee for Community Daycare was formed to fight for quality community-run daycare funded by the city in 1969. In the spring of 1970, the members of the committee demanded immediate funding for all the community groups operating child care programs. The money would be used for repairs, equipments, and to pay decent wages and health care to those working in them, and provided on-site training to the parents. In order to publicize these demands, parents and community activists from 7 centers blocked traffic in the street in front of Children's Storefront, which was a feminist center. After many demonstrations and sit-ins at the city offices in the fall of '70, the city granted the community centers interim funding, stipulating that the centers meet the requirements within 2 years. There was another hitch with interim funding. Funds were given on a month-to-month basis, which meant every month you had to beg, make trips to the commission, and demonstrate and fight to keep every penny and to keep the center going. Individual centers managed to get extensions over the 2 years, but not without struggle. By 1971, 164 centers out of the 300 received permanent public funds. 75% from the federal government and 12.5% from the state and city. These centers were open 8 to 6 and had a ratio of 1 adult to 5 kids, and a few centers were open on Saturday. In the spring of 1971, the city informed all the centers that a new state fee would go into effect. the new fee would force the working poor and middle class out of the centers and try to make the centers mainly for welfare. Faced with that resistance, we had more demonstrations, and our centers got fathered in so that our centers became legal but nothing else. Then finally, by the 1980s, since I have to hurry up, the centers gave up because Nixon was in office, and as much as we protested, we couldn't even keep our centers, which had been given a grandfather clause, open, and the centers became only for poor and neglected children. Now, the times changed, obviously, and it's not a happy ending, but one thing is that when I went to visit lots of the daycare centers when I was writing this a couple of years ago, the centers are still there, but in a diminished form. Eligibility is strictly controlled, and parents must be working or looking for work, and you have to be certified by a doctor to need special care. It's not like years ago when you could get daycare because you wanted your child to have an education, but most of these centers we built still exist, and some are bilingual, and some adhere to some feminist principles. Now, I want to introduce Premilla Nadesen, who's an associate professor of history at Barnard College and is the author of Welfare Warriors, the welfare rights movement in the United States in 2005, and Welfare in the United States, 2009, with Jennifer Mittelstadt and Marissa Chappell. She's currently working on the history
of domestic worker organizing.
Of domestic worker organizing. And she's been engaged in community activism around the issues of race, economic justice, and women's rights for the past 5 years.
That's my.
Oh.
Is it okay to close it?
Yeah, that's all right.
Yeah.
Okay,
I'm not sure what's going to happen. It's okay, go ahead.
The screen is already playing.
Yeah, yeah.
Oh, I still have this microphone on.
Oh. So I'll type this one.
Okay.
I'll go like this.
It's all right. We all know how to do it. I'm timing you. Okay, great. I want to just say welcome to all of you, and thank you for coming, and thanks to Roz and Barbara for organizing this panel. The title of our panel today is Expanding and Redefining the Traditional Women's Liberation Narrative. And there's been a lot of interesting conversation at this conference about the boundaries that define women's liberation, and also about how diverse and inclusive the women's liberation movement was. And I think there are people on both sides of this debate. I think for me, it's less about representation or about numbers than about definition.
dropped on Vietnam, which is a relatively small country. Right? The amount of bombs that were dropped on Vietnam during the war is 3 times how much we used during World War II. That's right. Right? So you can imagine the global scale of the war during World War II, triple that. That's how much was dropped on Vietnam. Twice as many bombs were actually dropped on South Vietnam, which is America's ally. There's a great quote by an American military officer who said, in order to save it, we had to destroy it. In order to save this village from communism, we had to destroy the village. So there were,
I don't think it's working, so just talk.
Okay. So instead of thinking about these women from Vietnam as victims that needed to be rescued, and there was some of that politics at the time.
Yay. Yay.
This image, I hope you can see it, was a publication by Women Strike for Peace, which is a middle-class housewife organization. Not everybody was a housewife, not everybody was middle class, but they really identify, or they at least publicly identify that as a way to state their political purpose. But here I call it a Vietnamese Madonna and Child. This woman looks utterly hopeless. She looks like she cannot even help herself. She needs saving from these Western angels that are coming in. Contrast that image on the top, your top right, to this image that's in the middle. Here's another Vietnamese woman with a child. She's got an AK-47 in one hand and a baby in the other. And she doesn't look like she needs saving. She looks like she's going to rescue herself. And that's what I'm really trying to explore in my book. This concept I'm describing is radical Orientalism. That activists at that time who are trying to critique American imperialism, American sexism, racism, that instead of turning towards the West for political inspiration, they were turning towards decolonizing Asia, revolutionary Asia, for political inspiration. I mentioned before I'm not going to talk about all the groups that were part of that conference. There were materialist activists, there was women liberation activists, but I did want to focus in particular on third world women and especially Asian American women. These are just some of the political artifacts from that time period. This is the international masthead of the Black Panther Party newspaper. And you notice 3 out of the 5 figures are Asian. Kim Il-sung, Mao Zedong, and Ho Chi Minh. I was not expecting to find this in the Black Panthers, but this is really a reflection of Eldridge Cleaver's delegation, his trip to these countries. This is a Chicano publication that was published by Bettina Martinez. She comes out of the civil rights movement, goes to the Southwest, helps ground herself in those communities and helps start a movement. She travels to Vietnam, and this is an issue in which she talks about the connections between the Chicano people and the Vietnamese. Their people, our people, that they're both peasant people, that they're both people who are advocating for independence, for reclaiming their homelands. This is a publication that came out of the Vancouver conference, and again, this is a Vietnamese woman with a gun. But I thought what's really interesting about this is that this woman is depicted like a First Nations woman, like an indigenous woman. Right? There's a way in which indigeneity, third world identity, is conflated with being Vietnamese. And then this is somebody who traveled with Randy with Eldridge Cleaver. This is Pat Sibby. This is her high school senior picture, and I describe this as an Asian American version of Jackie Kennedy. She just looks so goody-goody two-shoe, very kind of middle of the road, middle class. But she comes back from traveling to socialist Asia, and she's got the Mao suit. So you can really see how the travels transform people politically, but also physically. So why are there so many Asian American women who are involved with this movement? At the Vancouver conferences, some of the women who are there have a lot of conflicts with each other. So they're actually separate conferences. There's a conference for the Old Friends, for the materialist activists, for Women's Strike for Peace, Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. There's another part of the conference that's for women's liberation activists. And there's a third part of the conference that's for third world women. And within that third world women conference, Asian Americans constitute about 1/2 to 3/4 of the people who are going. So just to give you a sense of why people are so invested, this is an oral history from one person who attended. Growing up in the United States, your whole identity was not Asian. Your identity was just like you wanted to be a white person. So to us at that point, identifying ourselves as Asian Americans, wanting to learn more about our own histories, and being proud of the histories, and I think really looking up with other bona fides is a really big deal. So there's an identity going on being Asian, there's a third world coming, coalitions coming together, and there's this international thing with Vietnam, and at the same time people talking about China, and seeing what a shining example of what it would be like to be free. People who care about people in a country that provides for everyone. Just feeling the strength of the women and realizing how much women can do, and it really made me feel incredibly proud of being a woman. But there's lots of different layers in this, but I want to emphasize there's the racial component, her identifying with being an Asian American. And that means also identifying with other people of color. There's also this international consciousness. I heard some people kind of scoff a little bit when I read the part about China, but certainly at that time, there's very little information about China. And for radicals in the United States, what they saw was the Cultural Revolution, meaning the youth overturning the old, right? The youth overturning feudalism. It was not a complete picture of the Cultural Revolution, but it was a very selective, romanticized view. And then finally, there's a gender component here. I'm going to skip over this because just in interest of time, but I just wanted to share this quote if you want to read it really quickly. This person is a second-generation Japanese American, and a lot of the people who were there were third generation, so she's a little bit older. But she talks about just the physical connection she's making with these Vietnamese women, that they're physically small, that they're Asian, that there's a connection that they're making because of that. So let me spend a little bit more time on this particular point, which is that the Asian American women who are going to this conference are engaging in discussions about feminist analyses of war, racialized analyses of war, and they're sharing this information with women from Vietnam. And I have this phrase, the military and sexual complex. That's something that Joanne Nagel, who's a sociologist, describes as the way in which the military, the presence of the military, the institution of the military, fosters certain types of sexual practices, fosters certain types of sexual institutions, like red light districts. So one of the things that they're sharing with each other is the way in which the war fosters prostitution. And it fosters certain types of sexualized images of Vietnamese women and Asian women more broadly. So let me share with you a quote. I'll talk about these points a little bit later. This is from an Asian American soldier. And he says, we had these classes we had to go to taught by drill instructors, talking about American drill instructors, and every instructor would tell a joke before he began class. It would always be a dirty joke, usually having to do with prostitutes they had seen in Japan or in other parts of Asia while they were stationed overseas. The attitude of the Asian women being a doll, a useful toy, or something to play with usually came out in these jokes, and how they were not quite as human as white women, how Asian women's vaginas weren't like a white woman's, and rather they were slanted like their eyes. So if you can imagine, right, being in this context, it's not even a direct point this person's making, it's just part of the sexualized culture of the military. They're trying to reinforce among their soldiers a sense of alienation and distance, right, that these people who are usable and disposable. I'll just end with this point. And this is how the Asian American activists in their dialogue with Asian women are trying to foster this much more transnational understanding of race. We as Asian American women cannot separate ourselves from our Asian counterparts. Racism against them is too often racism against us. The mentality that keeps Susie Wong, Madame Butterfly, and Gookism alive turns human beings into racist, murdering soldiers, and also keeps Asian Americans from being able to live and feel like human beings. Just want to point out a few of these things. So Susie Wong is a fictional character. She's a prostitute with a heart of gold. She's operating in Imperial Hong Kong. Madame Butterfly, again, a fictional character, but she is a Japanese woman who provides sexual companionship, provides cultural knowledge to her Western lover, even has a child with him, and then he takes the child away and she commits suicide. Yeah. Right? So these stories really, again, replicate the sense of power inequality between the West and Asia, and it's often done through these sexualized relationships. And finally, the word gook, that's often been used as a derogatory phrase that's used during the Vietnam War. It actually originated during the US war in the Philippines, so there's a longer history of American empire. And originally, was referring to female genitalia, right? So there's a way in which sexualized depictions of women can be recycled as a way to serve as a derogatory term for everybody in that particular group. It gets recycled not only in the Philippines, but it's also there in the Korean War and again in the Vietnam War. Yeah, I should wrap up. So this just gives you a sample of what I'm doing with my book, and I'd be happy to answer questions.
And now we will have a traditional chair, Judy.
Okay, we're just going to open it up for whoever wants to offer questions or make comments. If you could just introduce yourselves before you do so, we'd really appreciate it.
I have a question for Premilla. My name is Lana Povitz. I'm a graduate student at NYU. I'm working on a history of food activism in New York. And one of the things I'm finding in my work is that a lot of the late 1960s grassroots organizers really had roots in the old left, or communists, particularly the women, as I'm mostly working with women. And I'm just wondering to what extent you're finding that in the domestic workers, like how if you're feeling communism there, or if there's the shadow of like the Red Scare, or what is the relationship?
I don't feel communism there. I mean, I feel echoes of an analysis of Marxist feminism in terms of housework and the importance of housework. But most of these women are actually coming out of community organizing or coming out of the civil rights movement. That's their sort of political history. And it's really less from a theoretical perspective than it is about their lived experience as domestic workers. And I think it's out of that that they're developing their theory.
Kind of
Go ahead.
I'm Amy Zandoni. I'm a graduate student at Rutgers in studying history. Speak up. Oh, I kind of extending on that question in terms of origins of some of these politics, and I'm thinking both with the daycares and also with the domestic workers that are mobilizing. I'm wondering about anti-poverty organizing in the late 60s, and if people had roots in the sort of economic justice, even like groups like UJoin or other war on poverty projects.
I'll just say very briefly, not among the domestic workers who I've looked at. They have been involved in the Black Power movement. Geraldine Roberts, who was organizing in Cleveland, got her start in the Black Power movement. Dorothy Bolden in Atlanta in the civil rights movement, but really not the anti-poverty movement as much.
I can speak.
Clara Fraser had a job in one of the poverty agencies, and she was able to use that as a way to mobilize several hundred women, overwhelmingly African American, to Olympia, Washington for one of the first abortion rights demonstrations, arguing that unless Washington state abortion laws were liberalized, women could not hold down jobs, stay in school if they didn't have control over their fertility. So many radicals, both quote from the old as well as from the new left, worked in a lot of these anti-poverty programs as a way to do forms of community organizing.
Nope. She asked about the daycare, the origins of the daycare.
Oh, the origins of the daycare?
Yeah, like the political experiences of the activists that were
There, it was mainly women's liberationist and community Hispanic and black women, and they weren't connected with the old left. It was just their need for childcare. It was their immediate need. There were no connections that I know of.
I was going to make a comment that within the Asian American movement, there was a lot of concern about poverty within their own community. So, for example, San Francisco Chinatown had, I think, the second highest rates of crowding compared to Manhattan. Right, Manhattan was the largest. Incredible rates of tuberculosis, very few public parks. So, I think there's a way in which that type of racial empowerment or kind of addressing of racial needs was very much connected with addressing economic needs. Both of you have your hands up.
Okay. Hi, I'm Jill Brennerman. I'm a filmmaker and video artist, and I made Heretics, a piece of which showed on Friday night. So I thought the program was too long, so I just said show the first 10 minutes. Okay, this is a question I think maybe principally for Barbara, and it's partly autobiographical, and it's just driven me wild for years, because I was part of a group in the city that had a variety of connections to other groups I was in. It was called New York Socialist Feminists, and it was toward the end of the 70s, so it was already getting on. I had been I had always thought I really missed out when I missed the union and the radical union in Brooklyn and some other earlier things like Red Stockings, because I got to New York much later. But I've never been able quite to put together the presence of the Seattle women, who were the other half of that group, with us New Yorkers. And there was a key figure in that who was a Trotskyist woman who the SWP had put up to run on a peace ticket at the beginning of World War II, Myra Tanner Weiss. And Myra became a friend of mine. I never completely got her story. Carol Munter was another person involved in this sort of incestuous thing. There are people scratching their heads. Anyway, the group developed in a way that was quite its own. It wasn't people from Seattle came and told the New Yorkers what to do. It was that a group of us were interested in having a context in which socialist feminism was brought again into the fore, and we were not wanting to be swept into the maw of liberal feminism, and we're looking to create a presence of socialist feminists in the city. So
I wasn't in New York then. My guess would be this was the Freedom Socialist Party.
Yes,
I'm not red baiting, by the way, believe me, I'm not, because they see themselves as a national, if not international group, and just because you named the name Myra Tanner Weiss. That would be my guess, but I'm speaking as somebody who was not in New York and not involved.
So I'm just wondering if people know more background. Myra left the CP after they ran her for mayor, and they had her writing garden columns for the CP.
I know a great deal about the Freedom Socialist Party, and I'm not going to talk about it. If you want to, you can look it up, and they have their own website, and they'll tell you all about themselves. I think I'd rather have them do it than me.
Okay, I've done all that. I thought you might know something about that set of...
Maybe the two of you could follow up afterwards.
Okay.
Yeah, follow up individually.
Any other questions? Yes.
Judy, I'm so excited about your work. My name is Agatha. I teach at Texas Women's University, and I'm working
Nice to meet you.
Thanks. I'm working on a project about feminist newsletters and newspapers published in the 1970s, and a lot of similar images come up in these newsletters and newspapers that I've looked at that are published primarily by white women's groups. But I've also looked at Triple Jeopardy, which was published by the Third World Women's Alliance in the early 70s. And so I'm trying to think about how to analyze these images and rhetoric that appear in these different kinds of publications from different racial and ethnic communities and activist groups, when the rhetoric is very similar and the imagery is very similar.
Yeah, well, it's so nice to meet you. We've been corresponding, but we haven't actually seen each other in person. I've been thinking about these underground newspapers and the ways in which images circulate and articles circulate, because they do get reproduced quite a bit, as this alternative public sphere. So I'm thinking about Benedict Anderson and the ways he talks about print capitalism as a basis for nationalism. And I'd like to think about these underground newspapers as a basis for internationalism. Right? These images circulate from Vietnam, from Cuba, from Algiers, and they get circulated through all these underground newspapers that appear throughout North America, in Europe as well. And I think that's another way to kind of create a sense of simultaneity in time and a sense of common connection, this kind of imagined sense connection.
Just one quick thing about that. The artist Faith Ringgold in 1969 was commissioned to do this extraordinary painting for the Women's House of Detention. And unfortunately, you've got to get arrested and go to Rikers Island Prison to go see it, which I don't recommend. It has been exhibited at other places, but it's in a book. But to see the painting, you've got to go to Rikers Island Prison. I taught there, so I know. But when she was interviewed about this, it was very interesting because she was trying to depict in one of the images an Asian woman. And she said she had no Asian women models. She just had to look at women on the streets. And so she talked about her difficulties in depicting other women of color with whom she did not have that familiar experience. And that's in 1969.
Who was the artist?
Faith Ringgold.
Her daughter was Michelle Alexander.
Her daughter is Michelle
Wallace, right.
But I wanted to mention in this context the work of Third World Newsreel, which brought real live motion pictures of the struggles of women in Asia, but also women in other liberation struggles, to our consciousness, and that's where many of us were so inspired by the struggles of Third World women, and they certainly were strong and powerful.
Do you want to say something, Randy?
Yeah, I'd like to maybe follow up to that. When I was in Vietnam last fall, actually brought there by my daughter, which was sort of a great thing for my mid-30s daughter to say, Mom, I'm taking you to Vietnam. So that was a really great thing. But we were able to meet with Madame Bin when we were there. And as a result of various things that happened over the next few months, I had the opportunity to help to edit an autobiography that she had written. And when I say edit, I don't mean change, I mean make recommendations for sort of the next version of it. It'll be coming out in the next probably year to 2 years, be published by University of Kentucky Press. I think that's what it's called. I'm looking at the academics because I think that's what it's called.
Because hangs there.
But I wanted to bring that up because I think it was Madame Nguyen Bin, and for those people in the room who may not remember who that was or may not know because you're younger, she was the lead negotiator for the initially for the National Liberation Front and then for the Provisional Revolutionary Government, or the PRG, in Paris, which is where the Paris peace talks were taking place. There's a lot more to say about that, but she kind of became, to a very great degree, the symbol.
Yes.
And Judy has this comment, Judy Gumbo-Albert has this comment about a poster, and she calls it the Live Like Her poster. And so we had a slogan, Madame Bin, Live Like Her.
I have a T-shirt that says that in
right.
orange.
Yeah.
And so there was a way in which she came to embody, for our generation, that feeling. And another friend of mine who's a woman historian named Carolyn Eisenberg, or used to be called Rusty Woods, her name's Carolyn Eisenberg. When she met with Madame Bin, because of a book she was writing a few years ago, she sat down next to her and she said, I feel like I'm sitting, she said something, I feel like I'm talking to a poster, or something. Well, I'm sure it was more. It was better said than that. But so that whole sense of how she came to embody this image of not only the strong woman, the woman with the baby and the gun, although she was a woman with a baby and a gun in an earlier time, but on the international stage.
Yeah.
And they were not quite so advanced in terms of women at that time, and even now maybe. But anyway, just wanted to share a little Madame Bin story.
Let me see if there's other comments, questions.
There's a woman back there.
Go ahead. Yes.
Hi, I'm Deborah Dinner. I teach at Washington University in St. Louis. And my question is directed at you, Judy, and you, Premilla. And I'm wondering if you could think about periodizing feminism and how your projects speak to one another. Because I was just thinking, listening to your projects, about the mid-1970s as being maybe a turn to international feminism, but also the end, maybe not. So, but how the turn to international feminism or global sisterhood efforts might speak or not speak to a vision of kind of the different versions of feminism and women's liberation by domestic workers in the U.S. and by middle-class feminists. So kind of how does these two kind of themes that you were speaking to about global sisterhood and then the tensions between, as well as the overlap between the different forms of women's liberation and class in the U.S. speak to each other, and using that to periodize them.
So I think that's a complicated question. I will do my best to answer it. In terms of global sisterhood or internationalism, the domestic worker rights movement was really focused on domestic issues. There was an important transition in the workforce in the mid-70s, where you see a movement of African American women who were leading this movement out of the occupation, and an influx of immigrant workers, many of whom were undocumented. And so this organization is dealing with that very transition, and they talk about the undocumented immigrant women as well as the documented immigrant women who are moving into the occupation. Chicana women, for example, Filipino women are starting to come in. And it's interesting to me because, there's a very long history of so-called tensions between African Americans and immigrant workers, and that doesn't manifest itself in this particular organization. And the leaders of the organization, the women in the organization, actually work very hard to try to incorporate an analysis of what we might call a kind of global sisterhood or an international feminism that, to me, it's not ultimately successful because the movement is actually dying out at this moment, but it's a very interesting moment to think about how people are grappling with these issues of diversity and difference within this particular movement. Does that answer your question enough? Judy.
It's a great question. The women's organizations I looked at may not all have identified as feminists, But they had a long history of internationalism. So Women's Strike for Peace meet with women in Vietnam in 1965. They meet in Indonesia. And some of those people were very much aware of the Cold War and wanted to de-escalate global tensions, prevent nuclear detonations and nuclear experimentation. So they were very globally minded. And certainly for the women's liberation activists, they're very much engaged in anti-war movements, thinking about global politics of womanhood. So I don't think it's necessarily a transnational term in the 70s. I think it's actually there throughout this time period.
Throughout the beginning.
Yeah.
We had people don't talk about it a lot, but Cuba people went on the sugar cane cutting brigades. I mean, we were internationalists from the beginning. South Africa, Palestine, all of them. If you look in women's newsletters, you see that.
I just want to follow up on the question about whether this internationalism allies differences between women. But the women's groups I looked at, there were a lot of conflicts between them. And in some ways, it was easier in some ways to relate to women internationally because they weren't as close domestically. But I think they could read different things from that alliance. So for example, Madame Bin talked about the fact that she was a mother, that she was separated from her family, and so that politics really resonated with women who are more maternalist-minded. But you could also read Vietnamese women as having these separatist communities because they're separated from men by war. They're operating their own families, their own villages, their own farms. So that could be a separatist female model for people who are maybe women's liberationists. Certainly Third World Women said, to see women of color in positions of political leadership, that was incredibly revolutionary. So I think they read different things in that relationship. There was this great article by Rita Mae Brown, right, Hanoi, so what is it from Hanoi? Yeah, so she's saying, why are we looking at women in Vietnam? Why aren't we looking at women in Hoboken? And she's interested in issues of sexuality as well as class. But her partner at the time was Charlotte Bunch, who was, right, international feminist scholar, and she was really deeply committed to those issues. So I think some of those debates about prioritizing domestic versus international was there, but there were other people who were trying to find ways to bridge both. Yes.
I just wanted to comment about the Women's Strike for Peace not necessarily identifying as a feminist organization, and I wondered if that was linked with a kind of communist critique of the language of feminism as too middle class and bourgeois.
Yeah. At least in Seattle, the women I interviewed said yes, it was. But by '73, everybody was involved in the women's movement. For better and for worse, all the groups.
In New York City, the first demonstration was against Women's Strike for Peace, in that we said, we're going to leave all that, behind, and we don't want to just do things because our men are doing things. We want to do things. We have much more power. We, as primary, not secondary people. And we had a burial of traditional womanhood. And it was at a Jeanette Rankin Brigade march, and the Women's Strike for Peace women were kind of shocked.
But they were there too, right?
Oh yes, they were there. They were there in greater numbers than we were.
There's a great flyer. If I had time, I would show it to you. It's 3 generations of peace activists. So you've got your grandmother's peace activists with Wilf, and you have Women's Strike for Peace with the fur collar and the pearls, and you have Women's Liberation with the peace sign and long hair and short skirts. But I think it was actually a flyer that was issued by all these different groups saying we need to find a way to work together. Yeah, and I think Women's Strike for Peace does evolve over time. Yes.
I'm sorry, I just have a quick follow-up because I got stuck with the names of people, but what I really wanted to say was how much I appreciated what the members of this panel suggest about intergenerational organizing. And it continues, I think, to be perplexing and sometimes viewed as, boomer nostalgia, and sometimes viewed as simply misunderstanding. And so as I've traveled with my film, the people who are most moved are the very youngest women who did not understand the emotional connections among those people in the small groups. And this is kind of for everybody, but given the depth in which each of you knows the history of a particular struggle, I'm wondering what ideas you have for ways of doing intergenerational work in which something positive can come from it.
There's a better hand up back there. That we can all answer. Zinga had too.
Did you want to say anything?
I don't either.
Let's get more questions.
Yeah, more questions. Yes.
Hi, my name is Zinga Frazier.
Stand up,
Right,
Zinga. Yay, Zinga.
Yeah. Hi,
Okay.
my name is Zinga Frazier. I'm postdoctoral fellow at Brooklyn College. Premilla, I just wanted to ask you a question in terms of your work on domestic workers, which I find fascinating. Did you find that there were kind of intraracial, what were the kind of intraracial dynamics, class struggles between Black women who weren't domestics and organizing them or working? Because I'm specifically thinking about women like in the NCNW or other mainstream Black women organizations that were prevalent in some of those spaces that you were looking at. I didn't know if you found like divisions, alliances, or how did class render the connections between Black women, right? Because there are differences.
That's a great question. There were a lot of African American men and women who wanted to distance themselves from that history of racial servitude that African American women had been confined to. But there were also a number of middle-class African American women who were very closely allied with this movement. Eleanor Holmes Norton, Shirley Chisholm. There were a number of women, and and they played an extremely important role. And one of the things I do is I have read a lot about their stories and their stories that they tell in terms of how they're supporting domestic workers. And their stories are always about the history of this work in their families, about what their mothers did, about what their grandmothers did, about what their aunts did. And it's kind of interesting to me the ways in which they were able to build solidarity around that kind of collective history and that collective memory of domestic labor.
So just to let you know, I have a letter of Dorothy Height talking to a number of domestic workers in Atlanta, right, in 1970, before they started the Black Family Picnic, right, and having those kind of conversations with women. So that's why I wanted to say.
Great, thank you.
There's a hand way back. Yes.
Oh, yeah, I have a question for you. I was wondering what the, you opened with this I think, calling question, or questioning the question about the sisterhood model. And I was curious to hear more about the response to these visits, to the travels, and in particular, what the archive is that you're working on at that end, at the reception end, like how if you interview women and what kinds of things, because it's a really rich project.
Yeah, thank you. I wish I had Vietnamese language skills, and I would love to do archival research there. I don't, unfortunately. But I did travel there and interview people who were hosts of American activists. And so it was very interesting to get their insights about why they were motivated to foster these travels. One of the wartime museums I traveled there in Vietnam had all these mementos from around the world. So travels from Germany, travels from Latin America, travels from the Middle East. And I was so US focused, but I was like, of course it makes sense that they are not just fighting a war on the battleground, but they're really trying to mobilize worldwide opinion to say this war has to stop. And so these travels are really essential for the Vietnamese to say, okay, this is what's really going on in the war. This is the impact of the war. This is how we're fighting the war. Can you take this message back to your constituents and do all you can to stop it? That was kind of the message I received.
Can I just say something about that? When I think it was about 12 years ago, I went to Hanoi and there's a women's museum. I don't know if they've updated it or anything.
Wonderful.
But when I went there were pictures of two women, Angela Davis and, of course, Jane Fonda. And I had a picture of when our women's group met in 1970. We talked about that 71 with a group of Vietnamese women from, we met in Vancouver, and I gave them a copy of the picture. And the woman who took me through the museum, she wasn't on that trip, but she remembered it, and she said, she just would repeat, it was Van Ann, who I think you met at one point.
Yeah, I did.
That was so important for them.
Oh, I was going to say, I think it's important for them to try to stop the war, but it was also good for morale for people in Vietnam. So there was a journalist who's responsible for translating articles about the United States to the Vietnamese, and he said his job was to look for weaknesses. So to report about the civil rights movement or report about the anti-war movement, to kind of give hope to people there to say, just keep fighting. There are people who are in support of us.
Eileen.
Forrest. So now that we're getting towards the end of the session and towards the end of the conference, I'd like to ask each one of you to take us a minute or two
and tell us how your story, one way in which your story, we can use your story to transform the larger narrative. Because, you know, you've been offering this, but it would be a nice sense of closure, at least this part of the conference, before we enter into the final panel, to what you take away, and what we should take away, as you see it, for that new narrative.
Oh, big question.
Well, I really think that the idea of this panel was to show that some of the issues that usually aren't written about, like reproductive rights, although they figure in this, it's much wider, the women's movement, and much more inclusive. And when you think of organizing welfare, organizing domestics, organizing daycare, I mean, most people say that the women's movement was all white. Well, this daycare movement was the minority white in New York. So, I mean, we were really in the minority. So that broadens the influence and aspects of the women's movement.
Well, I think I said a little bit of this, but I do think that we have to look at how feminist discourses are in conversation with one another. I think we can talk about the multiple narratives, but my question is, and I think some of the work that Roz is doing about how women were able to come together collectively on the ground, I think is part of the answer to that, is that there were issues, and I think the domestic worker rights movement too, because there were white middle class women who were supportive of that, labor feminists, there were middle class African American women who were supportive of that. So I think thinking about the ways in which the discourses can weave in and out together and are sometimes in tension, that's part of the history and that's part of the story that has to be told, can help us think, I think, about feminism in a more complicated way.
For instance, this daycare movement, which was almost 90% female, 99%, the women thought that they should have a head of the daycare movement. The only person that was paid would be a male because he would add influence. I mean, obviously the feminists didn't think that, but that was an argument we lost.
One thing I would just add, and I think Sarah Evans pointed to this, is that it's very important to study, and I'm a New Yorker, so I'm not anti-New York, but to look at the cities, I hope somebody writes about Austin, Texas, and Seattle, and Portland, and smaller towns, or what we're called provincial cities that have not been written about, because there's much about Seattle which is really quite unique, and it became unique because of its geographical isolation. In terms of Judy's work, Fort Lewis, which was the main military base outside of Seattle, was the second largest embarkation point to Vietnam. And so the issue of the war and soldiers, we did a lot of organizing of GI soldiers and not as sex objects. We went in as political operatives. So if you look at the regional areas, I think you will see even the enormous diversity of the kind of work that women and women's liberationists really did. Just to add one thing, there was a woman in our group who had worked for Willie Farah. So some of you may remember the Farah strike. So we actually, had connections with Chicanos who were in Eastern Washington. I'm not just saying this because I'm on a Seattle Board of Chamber of Commerce or anything, I'm not. But I think if you look at the development of the women's movement in different cities, I think you will find as rich and a diverse experience as we find in Seattle.
I guess there were two main things about my book, but also a couple things about global sisterhood itself. I really wanted to internationalize the study of American social movements, so really thinking about Vietnam as being intimately central to the political development of American activists. The other aspect about my book is I really want to highlight the ways in which Asia served as political inspiration. And originally when I conceived the book, I thought about Gandhi and the civil rights movement. I thought about sort of Asian religions and American counterculture, as well as the socialist left, Asian kind of socialist countries in the American left. So I really wanted to highlight that aspect of American political imaginary. In terms of global sisterhood, that it's not imposed from the West. It could be something that's fostered from women from around the world, and that it's not necessarily a monolithic political ideology. I was mentioning before how women of different political ideologies, orientations, generations, they might read something different about their relationship with women from Vietnam. So I really want to highlight that it's a concept, or it's a political project that is very complex and that should be recognized as such. Are we out of time?
What time do we end?
3:20.
What a superb panel. Just what a superb panel.
Diane.